March 9th, 1945. Tokyo burned. From the darkness above the Pacific, more than 300 B-29 superfortresses appeared as faint silhouettes, black wings gliding in formation under a blood-red moon. Their engines roared like an oncoming storm, drowning the stillness that had hung over the sleeping city. Then came the signal. At 12:08 a.m., the first wave released its cargo. Clusters of M69 incendiary bombs, each designed to ignite on impact. Within seconds, the heart of Tokyo turned into a furnace. Wooden homes, paper walls, and narrow alleys fed the flames like kindling. The firestorm devoured oxygen, pulling men, women, and children into a vortex of heat so intense that rivers boiled and steel rails bent like wax. For 6 hours, the city screamed. When dawn rose, 90,000 civilians were dead. 16 square miles of Tokyo, gone. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history, and at its center was a man named Curtis Emerson LeMay, 38 years old, a general with a cigar clenched between his teeth, and a reputation that terrified even his own pilots. He was not reckless. He was methodical, calculating. He had studied the failures of the early bombing campaigns, high-altitude raids that scattered explosives over empty fields and missed their targets by miles. He understood that precision from the sky required cold logic, not sympathy. In his words, "I didn't start this war, but I intend to finish it." LeMay's path to that night began long before the fire over Tokyo. He was born in Columbus, Ohio in 1906, just 50 miles from the Wright brothers' shop in Dayton. As a boy, he chased airplanes across open fields, running until they vanished into the horizon. That fascination never left him. By 22, he had an engineering degree from Ohio State University and a pilot's wings earned through relentless discipline. His peers called him the Iron Eagle. During the early years of World War II, LeMay commanded the 305th Bomb Group in England, a unit forged in exhaustion and fear. His bombers flew daylight raids over occupied Europe, facing swarms of Messerschmitt fighters and anti-aircraft fire thick as hail. Crews returned with shattered wings, punctured fuselages, and empty seats where friends had once sat. LeMay refused to bend. He trained his men harder, pushed them further, and demanded formation discipline that bordered on brutal. "If you're not scared," he told a pilot once, "you're not paying attention." But fear doesn't excuse sloppiness. He developed a new tactic. The combat box, a tight formation of 18 bombers flying as one defensive unit. When the lead plane dropped its bombs, the others released in perfect synchronization, saturating the target with surgical precision. It was cold efficiency born of survival. And it worked. By 1943, his methods had reshaped the U.S. 8th Air Force over Europe. General Ira Eaker, his superior, once remarked, "LeMay may not be human, but if I had 100 more like him, this war would already be over." But Europe was only the beginning. As the Allies closed in on Germany, the Pacific War still raged, a vast ocean of blood and attrition. Japanese cities built from wood and faith stood untouched by the kind of devastation LeMay believed could end a war faster than any invasion. In January 1945, he was sent to Guam to command the 21st Bomber Command. His new weapon, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress, the largest, most advanced bomber ever built, capable of carrying 10 tons of bombs over 3,000 miles. Yet the B-29 campaign had stalled. High-altitude raids failed to hit their targets. Jet stream winds scattered their payloads across the countryside. Fuel was wasted, lives were lost, and Tokyo still stood. LeMay saw what others refused to admit. Technology alone couldn't win a war, only adaptation could. So he changed everything. He ordered the bombers stripped of guns to lighten their load. He cut their altitude from 30,000 feet to 5,000, low enough for gunners on the ground to see the silver bellies flash in the firelight. And instead of explosives, he filled the bomb bays with napalm and magnesium incendiaries. It was a radical, horrifying shift, one that would turn Japan's cities into targets of fire rather than steel. His subordinates were stunned. Flying low meant exposing themselves to flak, searchlights, and fighters. But LeMay's reasoning was brutal in its clarity. The wooden homes of Japan were more vulnerable to flame than to blast. If destruction could force surrender, then fire was the weapon of choice. The mission began at sunset. Each bomber took off at 30-second intervals from Guam's runways. 400,000 gallons of fuel, 3,000 men, one objective: to burn the war out of Japan. Hours later, as the first crews reached Tokyo, they descended into a haze that glowed like molten glass. What they saw from above would haunt them for life. Entire districts collapsing in waves of flame, the wind howling through the inferno like a living thing. Some radio operators described seeing the reflection of the fire on their own wings from 80 miles away. Others said the smell reached the cockpit, the acrid mix of smoke, oil, and something human. By dawn, Tokyo was ash. Curtis LeMay stood by the airfield listening to the returning engines rumble in. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He simply watched the horizon, cigar burning down to its edge. He knew what he had done and what would come next, because Tokyo was only the first. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, one by one they would follow. And in the ruins, a new kind of war was being born, one that would change not only Japan's fate, but the entire future of modern warfare. England, 1942. Rain hammered the airfields at Thurley, flattening the mud into a dark mirror that reflected the waiting bombers. Massive, hulking B-17 flying fortresses lined wing to wing. Their aluminum skins gleamed beneath the searchlights, each one carrying a crew barely out of their 20s, men too young to know what they were about to endure. At the center of it all stood Colonel Curtis LeMay, square-jawed, eyes hard, voice low and steady. He had just arrived from the States, leading a brand-new formation, the 305th Bombardment Group. The orders were simple: take the fight to Hitler's heart. But LeMay knew what no one wanted to say aloud. America's air war over Europe was failing. Crews were missing their targets by miles. Bomb runs were chaos, evasive maneuvers, scattered formations, bombs dropped blind through cloud and flak. The Germans were carving them apart with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. LeMay walked the flight lines at dawn and spoke little. When he did, his words were iron. He told his crews, if we can't hit the target, we're just murderers wasting fuel. Precision, discipline, survival, that was his trinity. Inside the ready room, he pinned maps across the wall, grids of occupied France, Germany, and the Low Countries. His engineers studied wind drift, airspeed, and bomb spread patterns. His navigators recalculated routes to the meter. And LeMay himself, the man who once measured engine clearances with a slide rule, flew every mission until he understood what went wrong firsthand. He wasn't a general behind a desk. He was in the cockpit, in the freezing air, hearing the ping of shrapnel against the fuselage, smelling the burnt oil from engines hit mid-flight. He believed command meant sharing the same risks as the men under him. Then came his revelation. The combat box. He realized bombers alone were easy prey, but if they flew in tight geometric formations, each covering the blind spots of the others, their combined firepower became a fortress in the sky. 18 aircraft, synchronized like clockwork, overlapping arcs of machine gun fire. It was brutal efficiency, but it worked. Fighter losses soared, bomb accuracy improved. And for the first time, American daylight raids began to cut into Germany's industrial heart. In February 1943, LeMay led a daring test, intercepting the Italian ocean liner wrecks hundreds of miles off the U.S. coast. The message was clear: America's bombers could reach anything, anywhere. Months later, he commanded the Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, a two-pronged attack deep into Germany, targeting aircraft factories and ball-bearing plants essential to the Nazi war machine. The plan was audacious: bomb Regensburg, fly on to North Africa, and refuel there instead of returning to England. The losses were staggering. 60 bombers down, 100 damaged. But the mission crippled German production and proved that strategic bombing could strike the Reich itself. It also proved something else. LeMay's crews would follow him anywhere. They called him Old Iron Pants. He never flinched, never hesitated, and never asked a man to do what he wouldn't do himself. He inspected every returning bomber personally, walked through the wreckage-streaked wings, the burned-out cockpits. He spoke to the wounded, wrote letters for the dead. Then he lit his cigar, stood by the runway, and started planning the next mission. To LeMay, mercy was not cruelty's opposite. It was its consequence. He believed that by hitting harder now, fewer would die later. To shorten the war was, in his mind, the only moral act left. By late 1943, the results were undeniable. His tactics, formation discipline, synchronized drops, precise navigation, spread across the entire 8th Air Force. Other commanders began to copy his methods. Even British Bomber Command, known for its night raids, began to study the American approach to daylight precision strikes. General Ira Eaker said of him, "LeMay's bomb groups fly tighter, hit harder, and come home more often. He may not be human, but he's winning the war." Then came the promotion. At 37, Curtis LeMay became the youngest major general in the U.S. Army. His next command, the 3rd Bombardment Division, leading over 400 bombers in what would become the turning point of the air war. From the skies over Bremen to the factories of Schweinfurt and the oil fields of Meersburg, LeMay's tactics shattered the industrial core of Hitler's Reich. The German Luftwaffe, once untouchable, was bleeding to death. Yet behind the victories, the cost mounted. Every mission meant empty bunks, folded flags, telegrams sent to quiet American towns. Crews began calling their formations flying coffins. They followed orders, but their eyes were hollow, their luck running thin. LeMay saw it too. He rarely smiled, rarely slept. His men said he seemed carved from the same steel as his aircraft, unbending, cold, but carrying the weight of all their lives. By 1944, his work in Europe was done. The skies over Germany belonged to the Allies, and LeMay had proven that a war could be fought and won from above. But in the Pacific, another empire stood untouched, and the stakes were far higher. Japan had sworn to fight to the last man, woman, and child. An invasion would cost millions of lives. Washington needed someone ruthless enough to end it without invasion. Someone who could take the lessons of Europe, precision, pressure, and fire, and wield them against an enemy that refused surrender. That man was Curtis LeMay. When he boarded his transport for Guam in late 1944, he looked back only once at the gray English sky that had carried him this far. Ahead lay the Pacific, a new theater, a new kind of war, and in that vast expanse of ocean and fire, LeMay would earn a different kind of immortality. January 1945. The war in the Pacific had reached its breaking point. American Marines were clawing through volcanic rock on Iwo Jima. The Navy was bleeding in the Philippine Sea, and high above it all, the U.S. Army Air Forces struggled to bring Japan to its knees. The weapon was new, the mission unproven. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was the most advanced bomber ever built, a flying city of aluminum and firepower. 4 Wright Cyclone engines could carry it over 3,000 miles above 30,000 feet, far beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. But for all its promise, the results were disastrous. At those altitudes, the jet stream ripped the bomb patterns apart. Winds screamed across Japan at more than 200 miles per hour, scattering bombs miles off target. Crews flew 12-hour missions, only to return with little more than smoke and frustration. Factories still ran. Tokyo still burned only in theory. The Air Force needed results, so they sent in a man known for turning failure into firepower. Major General Curtis LeMay landed on Guam that January. A new theater, a new command, and a mission that would test the very limits of morality and war. He walked the airfields of the Mariana Islands in silence. Rows of B-29 stretched to the horizon, majestic mechanical beasts capable of reshaping nations, but the men who flew them were exhausted, angry, and disillusioned. They had been ordered to bomb from too high, too blind. Their accuracy was abysmal, their losses heavy. LeMay watched the ground crews load bombs under the humid Pacific sun. He chewed his cigar, thinking. Then he said quietly to his staff, "We're doing this all wrong." In a single decision, LeMay rewrote the doctrine of air warfare. He ordered the bombers to strip away their armor and remove most of their defensive guns. A shocking command that horrified his subordinates. "You're going to get them all killed," one colonel protested. LeMay simply replied, "We're already killing them by doing it wrong." The new plan was simple and terrifying. Fly low, fly at night, trade altitude for precision, trade safety for speed, and instead of high explosives, drop fire. Japanese cities, built mostly of wood and paper, were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. LeMay decided to deliver an inferno. His bomb bays would be filled with napalm and magnesium, small cylinders designed to burst open and spread flaming gel across entire neighborhoods. The first test came in March. The target, Tokyo. At sunset, waves of B-29s began lifting from Guam and Saipan, each taking off every 30 seconds, an unbroken chain of steel and fuel stretching across the sky. Their flight path covered 1,500 miles of open ocean. Inside each aircraft, 10 men sat in silence, their faces pale under the dim red cabin lights. At 12:08 a.m., the first bomber reached Tokyo. The bombardier toggled the release, and in that instant, the city turned into hell. Flames spread block to block, then district to district, merging into a single roaring firestorm. Winds fed the blaze until it became its own weather system. 100-foot walls of fire, swirling cyclones of smoke and heat that melted flesh and steel alike. Entire neighborhoods vanished in seconds. Those who ran found the streets aflame. Those who hid suffocated. The riverbanks filled with the dead. Civilians who had leapt into the water to escape the heat, only to boil alive. When the sun rose, 90,000 were gone. 16 square miles of Tokyo, gone. LeMay's crews returned to Guam shaken, their bomb bays empty, their voices quiet. Some cried, others vomited on the tarmac. LeMay didn't lecture them, he didn't congratulate them. He simply said, "This will end the war sooner. That's what matters." But Tokyo was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, his bombers hit Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama, one city after another. By June, half of Japan's urban landscape lay in ruins. To many, it was vengeance. To others, it was horror. But to LeMay, it was calculation, a means to end a war that had consumed the world. He never spoke in moral absolutes. He saw war as a problem to be solved, not a stage for emotion. His logic was simple and brutal. If fire could stop invasion, then fire was mercy. Historians would later call him the architect of modern strategic bombing, a title that both honored and condemned him. He didn't seek either. He sought results. From his headquarters on Guam, LeMay studied every report: wind speed, bomb pattern, damage assessment. He memorized maps until he could draw the cities of Japan from memory. When he found inefficiencies, he fixed them personally. When a crew made a mistake, he replaced the commander. Under his leadership, the 21st Bomber Command became the most efficient airstrike force in history. Even President Truman took notice. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were reduced to rubble. Yet the emperor refused surrender. Every night, LeMay's bombers took off again, engines glowing red in the tropical dark, carrying the promise of another city erased. Still, Japan did not yield. So the order came, a weapon unlike any other. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 from the 509th Composite Group lifted from the island of Tinian. Its name, Enola Gay, its mission, Hiroshima. The bomb dropped at 8:15 a.m. In an instant, 70,000 lives vanished. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The war was over, but the world had changed forever. In Washington, generals debated the legacy of the bombing campaign. Some said LeMay's fire raids had already broken Japan's will before the atomic bomb ever fell. Others said his methods blurred the line between strategy and horror. LeMay himself refused to justify it. When asked if he regretted the firebombing, he replied, "If I had lost the war, I'd be tried as a war criminal. Fortunately, we were on the winning side." He didn't smile when he said it. He was stating a fact. For LeMay, victory had always been defined by necessity. In his eyes, every life lost over Tokyo, Osaka, or Nagoya was one less to be lost on the beaches of Kyushu or Honshu. And when Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, when the rising sun flag fell over Tokyo Bay, Curtis LeMay had done what he set out to do. He had ended a world war through fire and iron, but even as the fires cooled, the next war had already begun. A silent one, colder, darker, fought not with bombs, but with deterrence. And once again, the man who burned Tokyo would find himself holding the match. 1946. The world was silent, but uneasy. The smoke over Japan had faded, yet a new kind of storm was forming. The United States stood victorious, unchallenged, armed with a weapon that had ended one war and begun another. In that fragile calm, General Curtis LeMay found no rest. He saw what others refused to see, that peace built on atomic power was not peace at all. It was a countdown. From the ashes of war, the U.S. Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, an independent branch with a singular purpose: control the skies and, by extension, the fate of the world. LeMay was at its heart. By 1948, he was placed in charge of a desperate mission, the Berlin airlift. The Soviets had cut off all land routes into West Berlin, choking the city of 2 million into starvation. The only hope was the sky. Cargo planes, C-47, C-54s, anything that could carry a load, were sent to deliver food, fuel, and medicine. The operation was chaos. Pilots were overworked, supplies were short, and Moscow watched, certain that the Allies would fail. Then LeMay arrived. He brought with him the same ruthless efficiency he had honed over Europe and Japan. He reorganized flight schedules, cut turnaround times, and turned the airlift into a machine. Every 3 minutes, a plane landed in Berlin. Every 3 minutes, another took off. Day and night, through snow, fog, and Soviet threats, they flew. By the end of the year, they had delivered more than 2 million tons of supplies, and the Soviet blockade collapsed. LeMay didn't call it a victory. He called it proof. Proof that air power could sustain a city, a nation, even a world order. That same year, he was given command of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, the new spear point of America's nuclear arsenal. When he arrived, he found disarray. Bases scattered, bombers unready, crews complacent. The atomic monopoly of the United States was decaying faster than anyone realized. LeMay saw vulnerability where others saw victory. He turned SAC into a fortress. He built underground command centers hardened against attack. He established 24-hour readiness protocols. Crews sleeping beside their planes, engines fueled, bomb bays armed, orders sealed. He demanded perfection. If a pilot was late by 30 seconds, he was out. If a base missed its readiness target, the commander was replaced. The message was clear. In a nuclear world, hesitation was death. LeMay's voice became legend across every airfield in America. He walked the tarmac at dawn, clipboard in hand, cigar in mouth. He asked no questions. He issued standards. His doctrine was simple and terrifying. Peace through deterrence. Keep the bombers ready. Keep the enemy afraid. By 1951, his command stretched from Alaska to Guam, a web of bases housing over 2,000 nuclear-capable aircraft. He introduced airborne alert missions, keeping bombers constantly in the air, orbiting Arctic routes toward the Soviet border, armed and ready to strike at a moment's notice. To the world, it was madness. To LeMay, it was stability. He told his men, "No one will attack us if they know they won't survive it." His strategy worked. For decades, the Soviet Union never dared to launch a nuclear strike. The world teetered on the edge, but it never fell. Yet LeMay's world was not one of comfort. He carried the weight of 2 wars and the shadow of annihilation. He understood what he had built, a civilization where peace existed only by fear. Under his command, the Strategic Air Command reached a level of precision unmatched in history. Crews could be airborne within 15 minutes. Bombers could reach Moscow in 6 hours. Every base, every pilot, every technician, drilled, tested, and replaced if they faltered. He ruled by results, not rhetoric. Some called him a tyrant. Others called him the only man keeping the Cold War from turning hot. By the late 1950s, LeMay's SAC was the single most powerful military organization on Earth. Its fleet of B-47s and B-52 Stratofortresses patrolled the skies day and night. The thunder of their engines a constant reminder that the next world war would be fought in minutes, not years. It was a paradox of his own making. To preserve peace, he had to live on the brink of destruction. He knew it and accepted it. When asked how he slept at night, LeMay replied, "With one eye open, the other watching the horizon." He never romanticized power. To him, nuclear weapons were tools, horrific but necessary. He once said, "If you're going to use force, use it overwhelmingly." That's how wars end. The same logic that burned Tokyo now guarded Washington. But there was a cost. The stress, the secrecy, the endless readiness. It wore on his men. Families lived in fear, not of enemies, but of orders that might never come. LeMay saw it, but didn't bend. He believed history would forgive what the present could not. In his words, "You don't win wars by dying for your country. You win them by making the other bastard die for his." It wasn't arrogance, it was conviction. The belief that the only way to prevent apocalypse was to stare it down. By 1957, Curtis LeMay had become more than a general. He was an institution, a symbol of American willpower and the embodiment of its shadow. And while the Cold War simmered, his bombers waited, silent, patient, eternal. The engines idled, the world held its breath. Because if deterrence ever failed, the next firestorm would not be over Tokyo or Berlin. It would be everywhere. The hum of the jet engines echoed across the tarmac. Another dawn at Offutt Air Force Base. Rows of B-52s sat in silence, their silver hulls glinting under the cold Nebraska sky. Inside the underground command post, maps of the world glowed with pulsing red lines, arcs of flight paths, launch windows, targets. LeMay walked through it all with his usual calm stride, cigar in hand, eyes fixed on the screens. Every day was the same ritual: test readiness, simulate the end of the world, then reset the clock. He didn't flinch at the scale of destruction projected before him. To him, it wasn't apocalypse, it was arithmetic. He believed survival depended on certainty. The Soviets had to know that the United States could and would respond instantly. No hesitation, no confusion. That belief became doctrine. SAC's motto, "Peace is our profession," was painted on every gate, every wall, every base. But to those who served under him, it was a warning as much as a promise. Then, in October 1962, the world tested that promise. American reconnaissance flights over Cuba had spotted them, long, dark shapes hidden under camouflage nets. Soviet nuclear missiles stationed just 90 miles from Florida. Washington froze. The president's advisors argued over every possible response. Naval blockades, negotiations, airstrikes, invasion. LeMay had no patience for hesitation. When he entered the briefing room, his words cut through the noise. "Mr. President," he said, "we're already at war. We just haven't admitted it yet." He wanted the missiles gone, by force if necessary. He laid out a plan, precision airstrikes on all known sites, followed by a full-scale invasion. It was simple, decisive, and catastrophic if wrong. Kennedy listened, jaw tight. He respected LeMay's results but feared his certainty. The young president saw a nuclear exchange as the end of civilization. LeMay saw it as a risk that could be controlled, if handled with overwhelming strength. The tension in the room was heavy enough to feel. LeMay, the warrior forged in the fires of Tokyo, now faced a generation that feared the weapon he had perfected. Days passed. The Navy encircled Cuba. SAC bombers went to full alert. Across the Arctic Circle, American and Soviet aircraft flew within sight of each other, missiles armed, engines running. The world waited for one wrong move. LeMay didn't blink. He increased readiness to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. His bombers flew round-the-clock patrols, circling the poles, ready to strike at the first order. He had trained for this his entire life, not to start war, but to make sure the other side blinked first. Behind his steel exterior, he understood the weight of it. Every hour of readiness meant thousands of families sleeping under the shadow of annihilation. But he never let it show. Fear, in his eyes, was contagious. On October 28th, the message came through. The Soviets would withdraw their missiles. The world exhaled. The war that almost was never came. To many, diplomacy had saved civilization. But inside SAC, the crews whispered a different truth. That LeMay's calm, relentless posture had forced Moscow to blink. He never took credit. He simply issued new orders. The alert would continue, because peace, he knew, was temporary. In the years that followed, the divide between LeMay and Washington deepened. Politicians wanted détente, disarmament, restraint. LeMay saw weakness in it. He argued that fear, not trust, was the only lasting deterrent. His voice grew sharper, his patience shorter. He called the idea of gradual disarmament a good way to get ourselves killed. He believed America's enemies respected only strength. He had learned it in the skies above Schweinfurt, in the flames of Tokyo, in the tension of Berlin, and he never forgot. By the mid-1960s, his command had shaped an entire generation of airmen. They followed his standards long after he left the room. They said his presence never truly faded, even when he retired in 1965. He had built the most powerful deterrent force in history, a machine that could erase nations, yet never had to. In the cold balance of terror, that restraint was victory. When he left his office for the last time, he didn't look back. His hair had turned silver, his face harder, his eyes unchanged. He handed his command to the next generation, men raised under his unrelenting discipline. The engines still roared, the bombers still flew, the red lines still pulsed on the maps. Curtis LeMay had left his mark not in medals or parades, but in the silence that followed. A silence born of fear, a peace held together by the threat of fire. History would judge him harshly, and also with awe. Some called him a savior, others a monster. He called himself neither. He called himself a soldier, one who did what needed to be done. When asked late in life whether he regretted the firebombing, the nuclear brinkmanship, the unyielding doctrine of fear, he paused for a long moment before saying, "No. Regret is for people who had another choice." He died in 1990, old and unshaken, but the world he built still lives. Every radar station, every nuclear protocol, every quiet midnight patrol in the skies. His shadow stretches across decades, invisible but constant. Because the truth is, Curtis LeMay changed not just how wars were fought, but how peace was kept. And in that fragile, dangerous balance, he left behind a lesson written in fire and steel. That sometimes the only way to prevent destruction is to be ready to unleash it.